Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a really refreshing space and a refreshingly blunt question. 2020, how did we get here? I started 2020 in Australia, where I was up very close with these extraordinary cataclysmic bushfires, which Lauren already mentioned. And I remember thinking that this is what it's like to experience the impact of a global crisis up close, and I had no idea really that 2020 was just getting started when I was observing what was going on there. But I think, of course, we can use 2020 as a marker, but we can overplay it in terms of trying to understand where we are with this intersection of different crises that Lorna laid out so well, from a very particular kind of economic crisis, which is not just a crisis of profit and overproduction, but an ideological crisis. I think it's very important to emphasize that, to the varying impacts of climate change and human movement, which we also heard in the last presentation, to crises of political representation and the attractions of authoritarianism, which Stephen, you mentioned, and certainly has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about here. What I think is important is to be able to try to understand or approach the intersection of these as different systemic crises that accelerate each other and that exacerbate each other. And it's for that reason, in this short comment, that I wanted to just focus on one system that in some ways plays through all of these different interconnecting systemic crises that we're trying to analyze at the moment. And that is, in a sense, the globalized media system, or we could even call it an ecosystem these days, which has always been, I suppose, very, in my experience, my limited experience of development education, has always been very central to thinking about development education. Media, in very basic ways, circulate meaning. They have a role to play every day, but also in spectacular ways. They have a role to play in making our lives meaningful, making our sense of the world meaningful. So in terms of thinking about global citizenship, the challenge of media has always been to understand its ambivalent potential. On the one hand, media has the capacity to increase a sense of interconnection, which is, I see, one of the key themes people have been talking about, and even increase a sense or an ethics of interdependence, an experience of being part of a shared world, if you like, while also, of course, feeding into this, the circulation of stereotypes, myths, accelerating antagonisms, all of these which have been key themes in development education, and looking, for example, at the representations of development or the developing world, inverted commas. Now, what's very clear, and has what clearly fed into many of the crises that we're trying to analyze, is that over the last few years, the question of interconnection has become much more structured into politics, structured into everyday life, in that digital media provide us with an unprecedented infrastructure of connection. One that is mobile, one that is ubiquitous, one that is inviting us through very many seductive corporate platforms to be part of an increased density of connections and a speed of connection in a very profound, everyday sort of way. Now, this, of course, has been around for a couple of years. And one thing was very noticeable in the last while is that broadly, if we were having this discussion 9-8 years ago, there would be a much more positive, much more hopeful, even kind of utopian approach to social media or to digital media, thinking of the ways in which they allow for very much more horizontal networking, the bypassing of different kinds of gatekeepers, the ways in which they allow different sorts of social movements and political movements, particularly in Southern Europe, in the Caucasus, in North Africa, to organize in ways which were unprecedented in that moment. Obviously, we fast forward a few years and start thinking about 2019, 2020, particularly under the influence of the current US presidency. And this narrative, if you like, of what social media, what digital media is and what it does, has become much more dystopian. It's very clear that media play and can play an increased role in exacerbating political and social conflicts and crises. And we can see this in the kind of vocabulary that is suddenly floating around, asking us to try to make sense of what's going on. We're talking about misinformation, fake news, post-truth, filter bubbles, and so on, terms which may be familiar to a lot of people. So I think what's going on at the moment is that when we think about the media ecosystem and the way that it plays through the different systemic crises we're trying to analyze, we're sort of struggling to capture and to analyze the ways in which these media systems provide political actors, often non-traditional political actors, and you mentioned sort of fascistic and authoritarian political actors centrally, provide them with new opportunity structures, and in fact benefit forms of reactionary politics much more than patient, progressive, coalition building, collective understanding, and so forth. And the second thing also mentioned by Lorna when she talked about the sort of fragmentation of meaning in everyday life is that the more generally, outside of things that are happening politically, the informational system that we live in, which people of course have very unequal access to and very unequal integration into, but nevertheless creates problems of developing common understandings, not agreement, not consensus, but common understandings on the social realities that we inhabit and what that means for action. So I just want to say a couple of things about that to wrap up and try to stay to the time. I think we have a challenge in trying to integrate thinking about media ecosystems into our evaluation of these intersecting crises, because we have to think hard about the terms of our inclusion. And I'd sort of put up two notes of warning, if you like. One thing we need to be able to do, and it sounds a little bit paradoxical, but we need to be able to explain the significance of media without putting media at the center of everything, without being media-centric about our explanations, without overestimating the power, while also thinking about the new forms of power which have been created at the moment. For example, take anti-mask protests in Europe. These are very clearly a product of online networking. These political formations wouldn't exist without social media, but they're happening in a context of social crisis, and it's a social crisis which is layered into a neoliberal crisis, that is a lack of faith or a crisis of faith in the state and in governance to provide for people's basic needs and to provide a sense of social, of a viable social future. The second thing is, I think we need to be able to evaluate the negative consequences of this media ecosystem without nostalgia, without thinking or without depending on an idea of a golden age of good media, which we have moved past, because of course, those media systems and those media histories were also very ambivalent in much the same ways and often characterized by unaccountable power of all kinds. So if we're looking at the current moment, I think we need to think about two aspects of this ecosystem that are playing into systemic crises in a variety of ways. One is clearly just the speed and density and ubiquity of connection and what this means for political mobilization. So if we have a look at, precisely as Stephen mentioned, very sort of headline authoritarian movements and leaders and moments in the world at the moment, they have benefited in unexpected ways and also in very predictable ways from the proliferation of social media. So in unexpected ways, for example, you can think about the use of WhatsApp in Brazil and India, a chat app which suddenly becomes a sort of a channel of propaganda. In predictable ways, it was always predictable that a platform like Facebook would lead to the kinds of problems that it has led to, because its business model is the production and circulation of discourse among as many points of contact and interconnection as possible in order to create profit. So the first problem I think we have is that within different scales of activity, local, regional, national, global, transnational, we depend on a kind of pseudo-public infrastructure that is private corporations who provide us with the possibility to do often very interesting and positive things, but also in terms of this ambivalence, very negative and very destructive things. And we need to think about their accountability. We need to think about how to make communications democratically accountable. The second point I would finish on is that we also have something of a crisis in the way that we think about the relationship between information, knowledge, and publics. There's so much information, there's so much fragmentation, as Lorna said, that it is now very, very difficult to build up shared meanings, shared understandings from which we can act. So I think a role for education, a role for activists is to try to think about how can we host, how can we cultivate different kinds of conversations where collective meanings can be generated, where the sort of practical understanding of the kind of hope that Lorna is talking about can be cultivated in ways that can be sustained. So I think there's a lot we need to think about at the level of public infrastructure and political intervention, but also collective and individual efforts around creating good practices. Thank you very much.